The Navy's standards didn't drop. America did. Everyone says the Navy lowered its standards. They didn't. In 1980, the Navy required recruits to meet a certain body fat percentage. Today, that number is exactly the same. The minimum test scores? Same. The medical disqualifiers? If anything, they've gotten more detailed, not more lenient. What changed is the country those recruits come from. In 1980, 13% of young Americans were obese. Today, it's over 40%. In 1980, anxiety and depression diagnoses among teenagers were rare enough that the military barely tracked them. Today, 1 in 3 young Americans has a documented mental health condition. The Navy didn't move the bar. America walked away from it. 77% of Americans aged 17 to 24 cannot qualify for military service today. That's not because the Navy got pickier. It's because the country that's supposed to produce sailors can no longer produce enough people who meet requirements that haven't changed in decades. This is the story the recruiting crisis headlines never tell you. There's a version of this story that sounds reasonable. The military is struggling to recruit. Therefore, the military must have unrealistic standards. Lower the bar, and the problem solves itself. It's a simple argument. It's also wrong. The assumption is that military standards are arbitrary, that some admiral somewhere decided recruits need to run a mile in a certain time because tradition demands it. But that's not how accession standards work. They exist because the job requires them. A sailor on an aircraft carrier works 12-hour shifts in extreme heat. They carry heavy equipment through narrow passageways. They respond to emergencies that require sprinting up ladders and dragging injured shipmates to safety. The fitness standards aren't about looking good in a uniform. They're about surviving the job. The same logic applies to test scores. The Navy operates nuclear reactors, integrated combat systems, and aircraft that cost $70 million each. The minimum aptitude requirements aren't bureaucratic hurdles. They're the baseline for operating equipment where mistakes kill people. And the medical standards? Those exist because a ship at sea is not a hospital. If a sailor has a condition that requires regular medication, specialized treatment, or monitoring that can't happen in the middle of the ocean, they can't deploy. It's not judgment, it's logistics. So when people say the Navy should just lower its standards, they're asking the Navy to accept people who can't do the job safely. And the Navy has 60 years of data showing what happens when you try that. More injuries in training, more washouts before the first deployment, more accidents at sea. The standards aren't the problem. The standards are the floor. If the standards stayed the same, what moved? Start with the most visible number, body composition. The Navy's body fat limits for male recruits have been roughly 22 to 26% since the 1990s. That number hasn't changed. What changed is how many Americans can meet it. In 1980, roughly 13% of Americans aged 12 to 19 were obese. Not overweight, obese. By 2000, that number had doubled to about 26%. By 2024, it was over 40%. And that's using the conservative definition. If you include everyone who exceeds military body composition standards, the number is closer to half of all young Americans. This isn't about aesthetics. Excess weight correlates directly with training injuries, stress fractures, heat casualties, joint problems. The Navy didn't decide one day that heavier recruits were unacceptable. The data showed that heavier recruits get hurt more often, wash out more often, and cost more to train. Now look at mental health. In 2000, roughly 10% of teenagers had a diagnosed anxiety order. By 2024, that number was over 30%. Depression followed the same curve. So did prescriptions for psychiatric medication. So the military is caught in a paradox. Society tells young people to seek help for mental health. The military says, if you sought help and got medication, you might not be deployable. The Navy didn't create that contradiction, but it has to live with the consequences. The same pattern appears in education. The Navy's minimum test scores, set by the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, or ASVAB, haven't increased. But the technical requirements of Navy jobs have. Nuclear propulsion, cybersecurity, aviation electronics, radar systems, the floor stayed the same, while the ceiling rose. And the population's test performance didn't rise with it. Here's what the data actually shows. In 2017, the Pentagon estimated that 71% of Americans aged 17 to 24 could not qualify for military service. By 2020, that number had risen to 77%. That's not a typo. More than 3 out of 4 young Americans are ineligible before a recruiter ever talks to them. The disqualifiers break down like this. Approximately 31% fail for weight alone. Another 8% fail for drug use. 7% fail for medical conditions. 4% for mental health history. 10 to 11% can't pass the aptitude test or don't have the required education. And here's the detail that makes it worse. 44% of those who are disqualified fail for multiple reasons. It's not one fixable problem. It's several problems stacked on top of each other. The obesity numbers deserve a closer look. In World War II, the military's problem was underweight recruits. Young men who hadn't had enough to eat during the Depression. The military had to feed them up before they could train. Today, the problem is reversed. The military is trying to figure out how to slim recruits down before they can handle basic training. The Navy itself isn't immune. A Department of Defense health survey found that 27% of active duty sailors are obese. Not recruits, sailors who already made it through. The problem doesn't stop at the recruiter's door. It's inside the fleet. The estimated cost of obesity-related health issues across the military runs between $1.5 and $1.7 billion per year. That's not a recruiting cost. That's an operational cost. Medical care, lost duty time, early separations, replacement training. The obvious response to all of this is just give more waivers. If the standards are disqualifying too many people, make exceptions. The military has tried this. The data isn't encouraging. Waivers exist for almost every disqualifying condition. Medical history, moral and legal issues, fitness standards, test scores. The system is designed to make exceptions when the circumstances justify it. The problem is what happens after the waiver is granted. Recruits who enter with waivers have significantly higher attrition rates. Depending on the study, somewhere between 20 and 30% higher than recruits who met all standards. They wash out of basic training more often. They fail to complete their first enlistment more often. They get injured more often. And the cost of each washout isn't trivial. Training a sailor through boot camp and initial schooling costs somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000, depending on the specialty. When that sailor doesn't make it to the fleet, that money is gone. The Navy has to start over with someone else. The Army experimented with expanded waivers between 2018 and 2024. They granted over 3,000 marijuana waivers. They increased felony waivers from around 100 per year to over 400. The result? They still missed their recruiting goals. And their early attrition numbers got worse. Some of this gets dismissed with nostalgia. My grandfather joined at 17 with flat feet and a bad eye. The greatest generation didn't need all these standards. That's true. It's also irrelevant. The Navy of 1943 was a mass mobilization force. At its peak, it had nearly 4 million sailors. Ships were simpler, systems were mechanical, training was measured in weeks, not months. And the assumption was that a significant percentage of these sailors weren't coming home. The modern Navy is a precision force. 340,000 active duty sailors operating equipment that didn't exist 2 generations ago. Nuclear reactors that require years of training to operate. Combat systems that integrate radar, missiles, and electronic warfare into networks where a single mistake can cascade across an entire strike group. The ships last longer too. A World War II destroyer might serve for 10 years. A modern destroyer serves for 30 or 40. That means the sailors operating it need to maintain systems that were designed before they were born and keep them running at a level of reliability that earlier generations never achieved. A modern destroyer serves for 30 or 40. That means the sailors operating it need to maintain systems that were designed before they were born and keep them running at a level of reliability that earlier generations never achieved. Deployments are longer. A World War II sailor might spend 6 months at sea during a major operation. A modern carrier deployment is routinely 9 months, sometimes longer. The physical and mental endurance required isn't comparable, and there's no surge capacity. In 1943, the Navy could absorb losses and fill gaps with the next wave of recruits. Today, every sailor represents years of specialized training. Losing one creates a gap that takes years to fill. The standards changed because the job changed. The question isn't whether your grandfather could have met today's requirements. The question is whether today's Navy could function with yesterday's recruits. The answer, based on what the modern fleet actually does, is no. What this means for readiness. Here's where the recruiting crisis stops being abstract. As of December 2025, the Navy reported 26,683 gaps at sea. That's not total manning shortfall. That's the number of positions on deployed ships that don't have a sailor filling them. A survey of ship executive officers, the second in command on every vessel, found that 63% said they didn't have enough sailors to complete basic maintenance. Not combat operations, basic maintenance. The work that keeps systems running and prevents equipment failures. Manning shortfalls compound over time. When a ship is understaffed, the sailors who are there work longer hours. Longer hours mean more fatigue. Fatigue means more mistakes. And mistakes on a warship can be catastrophic. In 2017, 2 guided missile destroyers, the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain, collided with commercial vessels within 3 months of each other. 17 sailors died. The investigations that followed found multiple causes, but fatigue and undermanning appeared in both reports. The Fitzgerald was operating with significant crew shortages. Watch teams were exhausted. Training had been deferred because there wasn't time to complete it. The McCain had similar issues. The sailors on the bridge didn't fully understand how to operate the ship's steering system, in part because the training pipeline hadn't kept up with system changes. These collisions weren't caused by recruiting failures alone, but recruiting failures contributed to the conditions that made them possible. When you don't have enough sailors, the ones you have get stretched thin. When they get stretched thin, they make mistakes. When they make mistakes, people die. The Navy isn't facing a recruiting crisis because it's too picky. It's facing a readiness crisis because the country isn't producing enough qualified people to operate the most complex warships ever built. The systems problem. This brings us back to the real issue. The Navy can't fix obesity rates. That's a food system problem, an education system problem, a healthcare system problem, an economic problem. The Navy can't undo 40 years of rising childhood obesity with a better recruiting commercial. The Navy can't fix mental health trends. It can't change how many teenagers are diagnosed with anxiety, prescribed medication, or documented in medical systems that follow them into adulthood. The Navy can't tell an 18-year-old to go back in time and not seek treatment. The Navy can't fix education. It can't raise test scores that have been flat for decades. It can't issue high school diplomas to people who dropped out. It can't teach reading comprehension to recruits who should have learned it in middle school. The Navy can't fix drug policy. Marijuana is legal in 23 states recreationally, 38 medically, but federal law still prohibits it, and the military is a federal institution. The contradiction between state and federal policy creates a disqualifier that affects millions of potential recruits, and the Navy has no power to resolve it. What the Navy can do is manage the consequences. And right now, the consequences are a shrinking pool of eligible Americans, a growing number of billets that can't be filled, and a fleet that is being asked to do more with fewer people. The Navy's standards didn't drop. If anything, the precision required to operate a modern fleet has made those standards more necessary than ever. What dropped is America's ability to meet them. That's not a judgment, it's a measurement. 77% of young Americans can't qualify, not because the bar moved, but because the country changed around it. This isn't a problem the Navy can solve by lowering standards or granting more waivers. The data shows that doesn't work. This is a problem that starts in childhood, in what kids eat, how they're educated, whether they stay out of trouble, whether they get help for mental health, and what kind of help they get. By the time a young American walks into a recruiting office, the outcome is largely already determined. The recruiter isn't a gatekeeper, they're the messenger. And increasingly the message is, we can't take you. The military has a recruiting crisis, but the crisis didn't start at MEPS. It started in schools and kitchens and doctors' offices and courtrooms, decades before anyone put on a uniform. The Navy's standards didn't drop, America did. If you want to understand the full scope of who can and can't serve, and why the numbers are so stark, watch Why 77% of Americans Can't Join the Military next.